In the follow-up, there was a 48.7 increase in blood flow. So while it was about a third of an increase after treatment, in the follow-up, there was a 50% increase. Hello and welcome to episode 2 of CMTV. I'm Aubrey.
And I'm Alison Kavanagh.
So today we're going to talk about a couple of different topics. Again, I'm kind of focusing on what I always consider to be my main area of interest, chronic pain and body work. And Ali, I think you're going to elaborate a bit more on the stuff we talked about the last day.
Yeah, I'm quite interested in the mast cells and the histamine response in terms of overproduction of histamine, what foods can trigger that and what foods are accelerators of histamine. So really quite interesting to kind of zone in on the do's and don'ts for managing histamine levels.
Yeah, that's really kind of occupying our focus a lot at the moment. Because like I said, we've been doing this for decades. We really focus on different elements, things that we might come across in an article or an interview or another podcast. And we start to delve into it and really try to get an understanding from that kind of holistic perspective, the kind of viewpoint that we were reared with, that you're looking at the evidence that's presented, but how does it tie into other things, that you are taking this holistic, the whole person into account and looking at other kind of influences. And there's some interesting stuff we're going to talk about with mast cells, and I'm going to be talking about low back pain in particular. So I don't know, what did you want to start with, Ali? Will I start with low back pain?
I think you should kick off, yeah.
Okay. So I was recently sent a research paper, which I thought was really interesting. This one is immediate effects of myofascial release treatment on lumbar microcirculation. Now, this is, we talked the last day about kind of different qualities of evidence. This is a randomized placebo-controlled trial, which is quite unusual because it's hard to do placebo massage.
Yeah.
Because if there's any kind of therapeutic intent, touch always has a benefit. It's always going to stimulate the nervous system in some regard. So it's interesting that they were able to do a placebo, a sham treatment, and still see significant differences between that and the group that actually received proper myofascial release. So in particular, this article was focused on the effect of myofascial release on low back pain. And they were particularly looking at what they call non-specific low back pain. So there's no trauma. It's just back pain that has kind of occurred without incident. It's something that kind of comes on over time. So that would usually be considered kind of a chronic injury rather than a traumatic injury. But what I thought was quite interesting, and we'll put a link to this in the show notes as well, so you guys can check out the research paper. Very detailed and very thorough. It also explains some of the techniques that were used. I think they reference Rolfing and then myofascial release as well. So we have a couple of interrelated things. We have Rolfing, named after Ida Rolf. Then Ida called it structural integration, which was this kind of approach to treating the fascia and other structures in the body. And then myofascial release. Anytime we see the suffix myo, it's always related to the muscular system. So in our last episode, we talked about how fascia within muscles is organized in different layers, but then how each of those layers have multiple layers within them. So even that outer layer of fascia on the muscle, depending on where it is in the body, it can have between 4 and 6 layers of fascial sheaths within that, which I thought, really interesting. So here they're looking at the thoracolumbar fascia, which is a very thick sheet of connective tissue in the low back that gives attachment to a lot of different muscles. And the interesting thing about fascia is they used to think that it was non-neurological. So it meant like they thought there was no nerve endings. They've now found it's actually the complete opposite. There's a huge amount of nerve endings in fascia. It's actually one of the most richly innervated tissues in the body, which means it's got a ton of nerve endings.
Yeah.
So the opposite of what they thought. So in this, they have a bit of jargon in here. They talk about the thoracolumbar fascia. They use the abbreviation TLF, and they're talking about the impact that it had on non-specific low back pain, as we said. And particularly, they were looking at blood flow. Now, they looked at a few other factors as well. Like they were looking at the physical activity of the candidates, their body mass index, and I think there was another thing as well. They were evaluating the morphology. So kind of the structure of the thoracolumbar fascia and how it changed in response to treatment and how that influenced blood flow. So what I thought was quite interesting was what they kind of, a lot of this is just from the abstract now. So this is quite quick and easy to read. The paper itself is very detailed, but you guys can have a look at the abstract. That they found that impaired blood flow could lead to hypoxia-induced inflammation.
Wow.
Yeah. So hypoxia, lack of oxygenation, there's not enough blood going through those tissues. And this is something we talk about a good bit.
Yeah.
That when fascia gets dehydrated, it gets stuck, We talked about this again in the last episode. So as the fascia gets stuck, it compresses or compromises the capillary bed.
Yeah.
It can also then compromise the nerves as well. So we can get an interference in the flow of fluid through nerves, which we would refer to as the axioplasmic flow, as well as accumulating metabolites and irritating the actual nerve endings. So what was really interesting here was that they found when they did this myofascial work, this structural integration, they did some manipulation of the thoracolumbar fascia, and they were mostly kind of stretching techniques. So again, really trying to create shear to unstick fascia. And the findings were staggering. So compared to the placebo group, so this is really measurable. They used, I think it was laser light to measure. And what they found was there was an increase, a significant increase in blood flow after treatment. And it was an average of 31.6%. So like almost a third more blood flow directly after treatment. Now, what I found staggering was in the follow-up, there was a 48.7 increase in blood flow. So while it was about a third of an increase after treatment, in the follow-up, there was a 50% increase. So if you're increasing the fluid dynamic, you make it easier for the hyaluronic acid, this kind of ground substance in the fascia, to absorb fluid, because hyaluronic acid is hydrophilic, so it draws water to it. Almost like the way salt will draw in fluid and it'll switch from a crystal into a soluble. It'll go into solution. So you can help to improve that. We used the analogy of wallpaper paste the last day. That if you get more water in, it becomes more fluid flowing. It becomes more like a gel. Like if you think of like hair gel, that it's that kind of consistency. For those of you who've never done wallpapering, that it is like hair gel, that kind of, rather than being dried out and hard and almost crystalline. So that means metabolites can get out of the tissues. It means there's less compression on nerves and less irritation. And this kind of led me on to a broader discussion. We were talking a little bit about this, that I think with pain is a really interesting thing. Pain is a sum of inputs. Pain is decided by the brain. Like there's these specialized nerve endings. We've talked about these before, nociceptors. And what are most people going to call nociceptors?
Pain receptors.
Yeah. So the shorthand is people refer to them as pain receptors. But in reality, they are threat receptors. And the threat has to cross a certain threshold that the input, we were saying like you stub your toe and you think the pain is coming from your toe. And it's not really. The information, the sensation is coming, the threat information is coming from the stubbed big toe. But the brain decides, is this enough of a threat? Am I going to register pain? Now, I thought an interesting analogy for this was, we said, it's a sum of inputs that the brain then decides, is this pain? And we were saying, like, if you take it to an extreme case, like if you have a small child that falls, like a toddler, they're a little bit shocked and stunned, and they will look for the parent's response. And if the parent kind of brushes it off, you're fine, you're okay, let's go. That is a different input. Now, it's an external input, but the child is still receiving the same stimulus from the fall, but then this mitigating input of, it's not that bad. The parent isn't freaked out. So it downregulates and doesn't perceive it as pain. If by comparison, if the parent, oh no, poor dear, and runs over and makes more of an issue out of it, the child feels, oh, something did go wrong. So now the stimulus from the fall, plus this external stimulus, the brain has decided this is a significant threat. We're going to trip over that threshold and it's now going to be registering as pain.
Yeah. And even something simple like rubbing the area, putting in other sensory input, there, soothing it, or another version, tapping it to distract from the pain, and even laughing, like laughing it off, nearly the way an animal or a dog would shake itself vigorously after it's had maybe a sudden shock, that there's ways of distracting the nervous system so that it doesn't register as much pain.
Yeah, and even that shaking response is quite interesting, where animals will oftentimes, it's part of getting out of the people talk about fight and flight. And then the third one that's not often talked about is freeze.
What fun.
And they talk about when an animal, like say a baby gazelle gets attacked by the lion attacks it, it goes comatose, it goes into kind of shock. And if the lion gets distracted and goes off, it takes a couple of minutes, but the gazelle will get up and it will shake vigorously. And this is something they say that humans have kind of lost through the evolutionary process, but animals will shake off to kind of reset the nervous system, and it gets rid of that stress response. Whereas we don't tend to do that,
no,
which is kind
so
of weird. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which kind of leads into a whole area that we might talk about, the effects of vibration and movement in terms of clearing nerve pathways.
Yeah.
Some interesting work. Read a book a few years back on people's response to low velocity car crashes, where they said there isn't actually tissue trauma, but the nervous system gets such a shock. It doesn't let go. If we were able to shake, we might be able to get rid of that shock and avoid some of the pain associated with those low velocity impacts. Maybe that's another area for discussion. We might come back to that.
Yeah.
So just to talk about the fascia itself, like we have an analogy here. I was using this. We were saying that where you have strands within the fascia, because fascia is really like all connective tissues. All connective tissues have three things in common. So they have three different elements. They are made up of fibers. They have some cells, and then they have a ground substance. So we could think of this as like the fluid, but the fluid's got stuff in it, stuff dissolved. So that's the ground substance. We mentioned hyaluronic acid. So if you think of it as almost like salt water, like sea salt has got different elements in suspension. So the fibers, this is just the fibers. We don't have cells, we don't have fluid, but the fibers have to be free to move. So as a muscle shortens, this fascial matrix kind of spreads apart like this. As it lengthens, it'll spread this way. And we talked about how if you're habitually holding one position, like if you're sitting a lot for work, and some muscles will be in this kind of stretched out position. If the fascia gets dehydrated, it becomes stuck, and these fibers have a hard time separating, hard time letting the muscle shorten fully. And this is just two-dimensional. You know, when we think about how there are layers upon layers within fascia and different levels of organization, that epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium. So if the muscle is constantly in a shortened position, like I think the hip flexors are a great example of this when we're talking about sitting, that the muscle is now in a shortened position and the fibers stick this way. And so they can't lengthen as easily. And that causes stress on the tissue, again, kicking in that kind of threat response that's usually at a low level. You were saying about the analogy of like the person who says, I was just tying my shoes, you know.
Yeah, and I put my back out, or I sneezed and I put my back out, or I just turned to pick up a cup of tea and my back went. And it's like, no, that's been building for quite a long time. And that's the straw that broke the camel's back.
It's the extra input that trips over from what we might consider to be the lower level of conscious awareness that's not causing pain to added stimulus that now adds up to, this is a threat, we're going to take it seriously, we're going to kick in some pain so that you mind this area, you do something to rehab it, that it gets better. Yeah, so quite an important point, how these things are oftentimes slowly building in the background, that you're completely unaware of it until it comes to a head. And we're talking about like other factors, like it's not just one thing. Yeah,
I often find with clients in the clinic, they think, oh, this just came on all of a sudden. And it's usually when 2, 3, maybe 4 things come to a head. They've had a period of stress. They're not sleeping well. Their nutrition isn't as good. Maybe they're not exercising or moving as much. And then there's that extra little push that just pushes them over the edge. So it's really looking at all the influences, all the inputs that, you know, you manage these things and get into good regular routines to mitigate some of the contributing factors.
Yeah. Which kind of brings us back to our research paper, that if you have this kind of hypoxia-induced inflammation, it can be quite low level. Now, we talked about if you're stretching, it can actually help resolve that, but then that would also help move those fascial layers. So we can see how these things are multi-layered. But it is oftentimes, the confluence of a couple of different factors, like sustained stress, sticking of the tissues, certain amount of dehydration, maybe dietary factors, poor sleep, you're just not moving enough. Interestingly, they talked about the negative effects of sitting, and they said that it can be mitigated really by just getting up and moving around periodically. So the ideal, they said, is about every hour to move for at least 2 to 3 minutes. And then you don't really suffer any negative effects compared to sitting in like 4-hour blocks where you don't get up and move. That's where the negative effects start to come in.
Yeah, I think just set an alarm on your phone that after an hour of work, you get up and move around. Because usually we get engrossed and lost in our work, and 2-3 hours have gone by and before we realise and we haven't moved. So yeah, timer is the way to go.
Yeah. And a lot of these things are about forming good habits. You know, I think it's surprising when people say, I don't like X, Y, or Z. Now, there's some things maybe you just cannot stomach, particularly in relation to some foods or things like that. But an awful lot of what we think we like and we dislike is habit. And when we start a new regime, if we can stick with it and develop new habits, then it doesn't seem like such a difficult thing to do. So setting the alarm might be important in the early stages so that it becomes habituated. It becomes a natural process, something you do without thinking. And then you'll maintain that, and you don't necessarily need to set an alarm because you've developed the habit of, I get up frequently. I get up and move around. And you might have even developed the habits of what you do. I make a cup of tea 1 hour and then I go, or herbal tea, if we're talking about the histamine, which we'll get to. And then you might say, well, the next one, I'm going to take maybe a comfort break. I'm going to take a loo break, or I'm going to just step outside and take a few deep breaths. You know, something to get a bit of fresh air. That you might be using different stimulus, different, almost like different reminders or different things you're going to do to remind you to get up and move around.
Yeah. Good idea.
Yeah. Anything else we need to say about that kind of low back pain that you're thinking of? Anything we mentioned before we move?
I think that people think they can mitigate it with stretching, but sometimes if the tissues are very stuck, some body work is really useful, or maybe foam rollering, or there's a number of different methods that can release the tissues, and then for maintenance you can stretch them.
Yeah, we might even do an episode where we talk about self-care. Again, let us know in the comments if that's something that you guys are interested in, that might talk about some of the different tools. Like foam rolling is a really interesting one and isn't always that well utilized. Can be beneficial, but is usually done in a less than optimal way. And we might look at some other methods as well that will enable you to do a certain amount of self-treatment yourself. But we do always say that therapy is, I think its job is to break the log jam of inactivity. That oftentimes if we're not used to moving and the tissues get stuck and we start to experience some chronic pain, we need to move to rehab, but movement is painful. So you can't do the thing you need to do. Yeah. That's the log jam. If therapy can come in and free those tissues up and reduce your pain, just for, like we said, a window of opportunity, then you can make use of that time where you're able to move more and you have less pain, and start that process of getting things moving again.
Absolutely.
I think a lot of people get stuck in that catch-22.
Yeah. And there's some myofascial release, even relaxation treatments based on Swedish style strokes, holistic massage, that the heat and movement from the therapist's hands can be enough to even start working on that superficial fascia to start unsticking the layers.
That might be something you guys are interested in. Again, let us know in the comments that if there are, say, a discussion that you guys might be interested in is the difference between some of the different kind of the main styles of massage and where each one's strengths lie and their suitability for particular things.
Yeah.
And again, I'm sure there's a lot of therapists out there would like to give us a lot of input on that and their experiences. By all means, share that with us in the comments. Or you can always email the college here. It's info@hcd.ie. We'd love to hear from you.
Excellent.
Okay, so we might come back to that topic of self-care and things that people can do. I'm really keen to hear a little bit more about what we've come across in the last few days on mast cells.
Yeah, just such a fascinating structure, their position and their location around the body, but just the fact that they're white blood cells, so they're really involved in our innate immunity within the body. They're kind of one of the first line of defences, and as a result they're distributed in areas that are going to come into contact more readily with foreign invaders, microorganisms that can irritate the body. So
pathogens nearly.
Pathogens, yeah, and irritants, whether it's pollen or dust or...
Because I think I mentioned in the last episode that they are under the skin, but I was thinking of them as in terms of being almost like lymph nodes, but they really are just specialised white blood cells.
Yeah, they're just so fascinating in the varieties of ways in which they can act. Obviously, they can produce histamine and heparin, but the fact that they can produce cytokines, you saw some interesting...
They've catalogued hundreds of different cytokines that they produce. Now, some of you may have heard of the term cytokine in relation to COVID, because that was one of the things they talked about in the lung, that you get this cytokine storm that would congest the lungs. And that was part of the complications that would arise from COVID, that it would also open the person up to other pathogens, that there was a whole slew of things. And it is this excessive release of histamine causing more and more release. But where we say about it being just under the skin, I thought that was really interesting when you were saying about being in the lung and the gut, because those are basically skin linings.
Yeah.
They're inside the body, so we don't think of them as skin, but it is kind of epithelial tissue.
Yeah.
So within the lungs and within the digestive tract, and that tied in very interestingly into the kind of symptoms you were saying. you
Yeah.
tend to suffer from.
Yeah, exactly. That at times the skin will just get really, really itchy. And even the fact that histamine is at higher levels in the evening and nighttime, because it's usually at nighttime you wake up and you're scratching, and it's like, that's why, because there's more histamine being released at that stage. But yet histamine even been found in nerves, that it can affect the fluid in nerves and can even lead to brain fog and headaches and things. So you've these seemingly different symptoms showing up around the body to do with skin rashes, irritation, bloating, digestive disorders. Even the response from the histamine can cause contraction of smooth muscle, and it can cause maybe diarrhea for some people, for stomach upset, maybe vomiting, that it can be quite severe and unpleasant if we have this overproduction of histamine. So they're quite prolific throughout the body in the areas that irritants need to be stopped. But I wasn't aware of the variety of things that they produce in terms of different types of histamine, maybe 100 different types of histamine, and then up to 1,000 different types of cytokines, and that they can produce antibodies, they can recruit other white blood cells to be activated, they can trigger particular T cells to come on board if there's a more immediate response required, if the body's really under attack. And that things like infection can trigger the histamine response. So it's not just foods. We can get the body to lower the histamine response by not introducing foods high in histamine or foods that liberate histamine. So we might even just go through a few of those different foods as an example.
Yeah, just even come back to the thing of them being white blood cells. I think what differentiates them is they don't tend to move around very much. They don't have a lot of motility.
Yeah.
So they tend to stay in these areas where we have these linings, as we said.
Yeah.
But even thinking in terms of how your condition has developed over time, that it would have started as a kid with your skin.
Eczema.
And then probably around teenage years, the digestive stuff.
Yeah.
And then really only in recent years, the breathing and lung stuff becoming apparent. But it's just interesting to see how it has progressed and how it has affected each of those three systems, and then tying it together and seeing the correlation.
Yeah.
That initially it might have seemed like almost an asthma type condition.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that it is tying back into the mast cell dysfunction and the excessive cytokine production, or histamine production, sorry.
Yes.
Cytokine, histamine.
But even the fact that it affects the permeability of blood vessels so that more fluid can come into an area, as I said, to flush it or have that cleansing effect. But I wasn't aware that it affected the smooth muscle as well, and that it can cause that constriction. So in the airways, that can feel like asthma type symptoms where the breathing can become quite laboured.
You probably would have had more of a difficulty with the inhalation, or was it the exhalation?
Exhalation.
Oh, exhalation, so similar to asthma.
Yeah, it's quite similar to asthma.
Okay. And I think there was foods, we were talking about the difference between foods that are high in histamine. I think you just said this, foods that are high in histamine, but don't necessarily trigger the mast cells to produce your own endogenous histamine inside the body. And then there's other foods that cause
The liberation.
those cells to become more active for those mast cells to start releasing histamine.
Yeah.
So I don't know, did you want to talk about some of those? Like there's some surprising ones.
Yeah, we mentioned some of them. I had switched to fermented foods to help heal the gut, because if there's leaky gut, you're getting more histamine into the bloodstream and a stronger histamine response. But then fermented foods can also contain high levels of histamine because the bacterial growth due to the fermentation process. So things like even sourdough bread, which, thinking I was gluten intolerant, I thought, oh, well, sourdough, the action of it being fermented for maybe 48 hours or 72 hours meant that more of the gluten was used up and it should suit the gut quite well. So it's kind of a bit of a catch-22 between healing the gut so you don't get as strong a response to the histamine, but if you need a high histamine food to, the high histamine food could then trigger a reaction. Yeah. So a low histamine diet is really useful. I'd say going from the very acute stage, if you're in a histamine attack, fasting is actually quite useful. Even just taking a day of fasting just to allow the body to catch up and to calm down.
It's funny, our dad used to be a big fan of fasting, and he used to oftentimes, for different kinds of conditions, like I remember things like, was it gallstones? He used to recommend people would, maybe not gallstones. There was a diet that he used to always recommend. Oh, it was for appendix trouble, I think. He'd say like eat grapes or pears for a day or two, that you don't have to completely fast.
Yeah.
Although he himself did, he would oftentimes he'd fast for a day, he'd eat fruit for a day. He had a very, very clean, healthy diet, certainly while he was studying to be a yoga teacher. And it was really interesting as kids, like anytime we had the slightest little hint of any kind of appendix type stuff, he would say, okay, we're going to be eating pears for a day.
Yeah.
And it did. It means that now, I mean, in our 50s,
Yeah.
I won't say about Daddy, I'm in my 50s, that we still have our appendix, we still have our tonsils. They never give us any trouble.
Yeah.
Because you didn't overload them at times when they were already struggling.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, that's a little off topic.
No, not at all. So some of the surprises for me were avocados. I didn't think avocados were particularly high in histamine. And again, depending on how much of a trigger it is for you, you might get away with one per week. Whereas I was inclined to eat avocado every day because the healthy fats and it was so nutrient dense and so on. The other one was tomatoes. Raw tomatoes do seem to really elicit a high histamine reaction. Some people will even get hives and things from them, but once cooked, they're fine. So I'll be fine with a salsa or a cooked tomato, but not so much the raw.
That's funny because like I would always have had that as an innate thing. I never liked, and again, could be just coincidence, but I never liked raw tomato.
Yeah.
But yet I'd really enjoy cooked tomato.
Yeah.
Like if you had a roast tomato or something like that, like
Yeah.
I'd really enjoy it when it was cooked, but wouldn't eat it raw.
Yeah. So there you go. Other foods that I thought were interesting, obviously the fermented products like soy sauce and soy products, miso soups and things like that. Again, things that I absolutely love. And I was like, oh, okay, not those. So we'll post a list of the different high histamine foods so that you can check them out and try them out. We said the cured meats and very processed foods are definitely one to avoid. Buying stuff fresh on the day and using it. If you're not going to use it on the day, freeze it. And then even the methods of cooking can be relevant, not to deep fry stuff for a lot of reasons, apart from the damaged oils, but that boiling foods, lighter cooking methods seem to work better.
I think we would have been aware of that over the years from reading and attending lectures by Udo Erasmus. Those of you might be familiar with Udo's oil. And he talked about like, you know, how you should never deep fry and really you shouldn't shallow fry. Mm-hmm. If you were going to shallow fry, you should use some water and just a small amount of oil. That it's the degree to which the oil heats up is equivalent to how damaged that oil is. And the more damaged it is, the more harmful it is for you. And what I thought was really interesting was they said what we normally think of health as healthy oils, like
vegetable oils,
but I think in particular olive oil, that they're great, but when you cook them, they actually become some of the most toxic. And that other things like the shorter carbon chain oils like butter to be cooked with, the coconut oil, things like that, actually mutate less. And so if you are going to cook, it's better to cook with something like that.
Yeah.
Even though on a salad, you might say well, the opposite would be true. Olive oil, a fresh olive oil would be fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah. I think we could do nearly a whole episode on healthy fats and so on, that it's so interesting of what the different fats are, what categories they fall into, what they're used for in the body.
So Udo's book, we've talked about this, well, amongst ourselves, is Fats That Heal, Fats That Kill. And that's an excellent book, really worth reading. We might talk about this in more detail, but if you guys want to read up in the meantime, Fats That Heal, Fats That Kill. It has a lot of good information, but that first chapter is kind of technical.
Can be a bit heavy going.
Where he talks about like kind of the carbon chain lengths in different oils. But if you get past that first chapter, it's really easy to read. It's in very straightforward, plain English. So it's not that difficult. But sorry, you were saying about cooking methods for the histamine response.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a good idea. We'll come back and do more on the fats, how they affect the body, the importance of healthy fats, where to get them, and what damaged fats can do. Anyway, I might come back to the histamine foods. We said that there's particular foods that can liberate histamine. So things like strawberries and citrus fruit. So particularly lemons and things and oranges and stuff. Some of the berries that you can eat, particularly blueberries, are quite good. They say melon is quite good. Watermelon, cantaloupe and so on are quite good. So instead of focusing on all the things you can't have, you want to look at some of the things that you can have. So things that naturally lower histamine are things like ginger, So you might make your own ginger tea or incorporate ginger into your cooking. Garlic, other things that have quercetin in it. So apples apparently are really good for lowering histamine. So an apple a day really does keep the doctor away.
Isn't it funny how some of those, the old adages, there's always a grain of truth in everything.
Yeah.
Sometimes the meaning can be lost to time, but there is a validity to a lot of those kind of traditional ideas and concepts.
Yeah.
But it's interesting about the strawberries, because I used to find that I'd love strawberries, but if I ate too much of them, I'd get almost like little hives as a kid. Yeah.
Also, there's some supplements that support the mast cells, so particularly vitamin D and vitamin C. They help to regulate the amount of histamine that the mast cells are producing. Again, I think we could do a whole episode on the vitamin D and the importance of it, the relevance of it for health, and what sources and what concentrations and how you know you need it, and so on. Yeah, I think that's pretty much as much as I wanted to say on that. We just mentioned fermented foods, and vinegars come in under that balsamic vinegar, but there is an exception, which is apple cider vinegar. That seems to not have the same histamine release as other fermented or balsamic vinegars.
That's interesting, because balsamic would always be kind of sweeter. So I wonder, is it something to do with a type of sugars in the balsamic, or
how it's aged?
Or how it's aged.
Yeah.
That apple cider vinegar is a lot sharper, but definitely good for you, and actually a very good source of potassium as well.
Yes.
Again, our dad used to talk about that a lot, that apple cider vinegar was a great way of getting potassium in, more so than the other foods. Like the thing that everybody always thinks of is bananas, which the potassium, Dad always felt that it wasn't terribly absorbable from bananas, but that it was readily absorbable from apple cider vinegar, particularly when it's diluted in water, because being in solution like that, it gets absorbed from the stomach. So absorption is very quick and very thorough, very complete.
Yeah, particularly if you're getting a really severe cramp and it's just not letting go. Nearly as you're drinking the apple cider vinegar in the water, the cramp starts to ease. The delivery is that fast.
And I used to find that with snowboarding, that I'd always have a little bit of apple cider vinegar in the water in my backpack. So first thing in the morning when you're trying to warm up, you'd be taking a little bit of apple cider vinegar as you go. And sometimes you would feel your feet starting to cramp in the early part of the day, and it would ease out very quickly.
Yeah.
Whether that was just down to the exercise or the apple cider vinegar, it definitely worked either way, and it meant I was getting good potassium throughout that ski holiday, which is great. So yeah, was there anything else we wanted to say then?
No, I think that's about it. We're follow this space. We'll be trying out some of the different foods, trying the low histamine diet, looking at correcting the levels of bacteria in the small intestine, healing the gut, and just seeing what effect it has.
I actually got a notification today that our probiotic is arriving today, so we'll be getting started on that, and we'll give you feedback probably in about 2 or 3 weeks' time. Give it a bit of time to take effect and see how we get on.
Yeah.
So yeah. Okay. So other than that, I suppose we'd say give us feedback in the comments. Let us know what kind of things you'd like to hear us discuss in future. We obviously will have our own topics that we'll be dealing with as we go along. And thank you for joining us.
See you next time.